Dancing Professor. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about usability laboratory studies, one of the most common user experience and human factors methodology techniques. As an overview, what we're going to be talking about is, first of all, we're going to try to understand what a usability study is. We're going to understand all of the elements that go into a usability study, including the target audience and participants, the materials used for the study, what are the main goals of a usability study and how it separates from other types of methodologies we use in human factors, and we're also going to talk about how to interpret results from a usability study. The next section will focus on how to actually conduct a usability study. And as a third part to this lecture, please check out the case study where we evaluate the Uber app. So in terms of conducting your own usability study, we're going to talk about the elements that go into creating a research script. We're also going to talk about the importance of a consent form. We're going to talk about the different ways that we can implement observation techniques. And we're also going to talk about a cohesive and a concise way to sum up the results in an actual report, and then what you do with that report once it's finished. So, what is a usability laboratory study? Well, there are a variety of methods that can be used in a laboratory setting, and the most common one is a usability study. Other common laboratory studies include concept testing, cognitive walkthroughs, A/B testing, but all of these have the common goal of focusing on understanding user behavior, needs, and motivations through observation techniques, task analysis, and other types of feedback. The only reason we call it a laboratory study is because we're actually bringing participants into the lab where we can actually ask them questions and measure various aspects of their behavior. The opposite of a laboratory setting would be something like in the field, right? When you're doing an observation study, but you're actually watching people interact in their natural environment. So although those are also very, very helpful, we feel like it's very important to conduct laboratory studies to get a lot of detailed feedback from one participant at a time. So, again, what happens in a laboratory study is that users are brought into a laboratory and they're actually observed while they're interacting with the product. The ratio of a researcher to participant is 1-to-1, which means for every one researcher, there is just one participant. This is different from a focus group when sometimes you have about 20 participants and one facilitator or one researcher. In a laboratory study, you just have one researcher and one participant at a time. So, the first thing to do for a usability study is to identify your target audience. So, before you begin conducting a usability study, you need to identify a few key requirements. And that first one is, who is your target audience? Which means you have to develop a participant profile. You have to understand who in fact is going to be using this product once it's developed, or if the product already is developed, you want to understand who is currently using it. So this type of information is usually given to researchers by a stakeholder or a product manager. Or in a sense, you could think of these people as a client, right? Somebody had to come to the researcher and say, hey, I really need research conducted on X, can you please help me? And at that point, you would ask that particular client what kind of people they expect the product to be used by. So, what are the characteristics of these main users or main consumers of the product? What age range do they fall in? What kind of experience should they have prior to interacting with this particular product? So these criteria, in fact, should define your lab study participants. So for example, if you were testing Canvas, which is an educational software, your target audience will probably be students who use it to access assignments, submit assignments, communicate with their teachers, as well as by teachers who use it to upload and post resources for their students. Those who are not in the educational domain are not going to be the ones that you want to use as participants. So next, in terms of participants, once you have identified the participant profile, you should recruit about 5 to 7 participants for a usability laboratory study. Now, why do we say 5 to 7? Well, 5 is sort of the minimum because we want to, again, seriously?
Come on.
Once you have identified the participant profile, you actually want to recruit about 5 to 7 participants. Now, why 5 to 7? Well, again, when we recruit participants, participants serve as a sample of a larger population. And again, keeping in mind those particular characteristics for the users or future users of this product, you want to get as big of a representation from the population as you can. You also have to consider that you're going to spend about 45 minutes to 1 hour with each participant alone. And so typically when you're working as a researcher and you typically have some sort of a deadline and you've got to get as much information as you can in the shortest amount of time possible, you have to plan your time wisely. And so if you've got to squeeze in 7 participants in one workday, which is typically 8 hours, you can't do more than 7. And so again, you also have to plan at least 15 minutes between sessions to reset all of your research materials, right? You want to reset your cameras, you want to reset your devices. If there's any sort of logging in and logging out that needs to occur, you want to reset everything to the 0 state for the next person to walk in. And sometimes you just might need to go to the bathroom or eat a snack. So please don't overestimate the necessity to have some sort of a grace period between each participant. Now in terms of testing materials. Well, materials for each usability study are going to vary depending on the product that you're testing. Sometimes you're going to be testing products that already exist in the market, and you're really considering how to improve something that already exists, how to make it better. Other times you might be testing prototypes of products that are currently in development. So prototype is actually a really key word when it comes to user experience and human factors research. And a prototype is defined as a sample or model of what the final product may look like. It's used to test a concept or design for immediate usability issues. So, not sure if you guys know this, but it takes a long time to actually build a product, right? It takes a long time for designers to come up with what it will look like, and then those designers need to communicate that information to the engineers, and the engineers actually make it do what the designers want it to do. That takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of money and a lot of effort. So if there are certain issues with usability that could be identified before the product is fully built out, we use prototypes to address those issues. And so prototypes are usually used for testing in early stages of design, and as we mentioned, it's beneficial for saving time and resources for designers and engineers. Continuing with our discussion on materials, after you identify the product that you're testing, and this could be a digital prototype, this could be a paper image, this could be a wireframe. There are a variety of different ways that shapes and forms that a prototype could take. But basically, after you've gotten those prototypes, you want to consider the device on which the product is being tested. So some common devices that we have are mobile phones, desktop computers, tablets or iPads, etc. And it would actually be really interesting to check out how, let's say, your favorite app you choose could be different from a mobile phone than from a desktop or from a tablet or iPad. So oftentimes there are different designs, right? And if you go onto a web page and you try to open it on your mobile phone, it often asks you and brings up this prompt that says, would you like to open in the mobile version or the web version? So it's really important to consider these things when you're conducting your usability tests. So the same technology product can be operated differently across the various devices and platforms. So if in your lab study you're testing a website on a desktop computer, then you can't really generalize those results to the website on a mobile phone. You would actually have to run a separate usability study for the same website on a mobile phone. So make sure your usability test specifies which device you're actually using for testing. Now, you really have to consider recording each usability session. Please do not overestimate your ability to remember everything you observe in a laboratory study. Videotaping participants' interactions to see where and when they do things is very, very helpful. Videotaping their comments is just as important because they really explain the reasoning behind their behaviors. This is really, really useful for obtaining user quotes, which clients like to see and hear when you actually create those results reports. So the client or stakeholder and the design team may also want to see how the laboratory studies went. So it's one thing to read the report, but it's another thing for the team to actually see how users interacted with it. Perhaps they might not believe something that you put in your report, or perhaps they would want more information about a particular case that you mentioned in your report. So having video recordings and or audio recordings for other members of the team to look over at a later time is very, very important. And again, because you can't invite the entire team to your session, a good researcher always makes the recordings available to them after the studies are over. So this next slide is really, really important to understand the main goals of a usability study. So here are the main things a usability study is used for. The first one is to identify usability problems of products. That seems like it's, embedded in the title of usability, but really what is usability? Well, we really want to understand and collect quantitative data on user performance because that really helps us identify usability. So quantitative refers to numerical data, right? It's the opposite of qualitative, which is more interview structured and verbal responses. So in terms of things that you can actually count or measure in a usability study, these can be things like the amount of time it took participants to complete a task. Typically, technology is designed to improve our lives and speed up any particular process that we want to accomplish. So typically, the longer completion time indicates lower usability. If a participant is able to complete what they want to complete in a short amount of time, we consider that as user-friendly. The other thing that you can measure is the number of errors a participant makes. So let's say while you assign a particular task to a participant, like log into this particular app, if they have difficulty doing that, or if they keep clicking or tapping in different and wrong areas of the screen, each of those could be considered as an error. So again here, the more errors indicate lower usability, right? So the more mistakes you make would indicate that the product was harder to use, and therefore the usability is hindered. So similarly, we can also collect qualitative data, and we can ask participants, let's say, after they would log in to the particular app, we can ask them, how understandable was that feature, and based on the number of errors they make, we can also probe a little bit deeper, but this time we can ask them, did you find that easy or difficult? If they say something like, it was difficult, you would say, okay, why? Can you tell me why? And they might say something like, oh, well, the button, the call to action wasn't clear enough, right? It was red instead of being green. The icon was too small, etc., etc. But basically, the qualitative portion helps you understand why those particular mistakes were made, why it took so long to actually complete the task. And then you also want to ask them whether or not they were satisfied with that particular feature. So again, we have to understand that designers have a very specific way of thinking about their products, and they've been looking at this product for a very long time, that it's hard for them to understand how it could possibly not be usable. So that's what usability studies do. They really help us understand how a particular user or consumer who has no idea and who has never seen this product before would actually be able or not able to interact with it. Additionally, we can elicit feedback on ways to improve the product. So if you say that the icon was too small, that's a really easy fix sometimes. You could just make it a little bit bigger. If it's a color change, if it's in a different location, if everyone is constantly looking to the left and the icon is on the right, that may also be a sign that perhaps we should move the icon to a different location. So we really want to understand a user's perspective of the product and not the designers and not the engineers. It also allows us to discover a variety of mental models that users may have when interacting with the product. So a mental model is sort of how we're used to thinking about things. So for example, we look at this remote control, and we have a mental model that remotes are used to control things remotely, right? So not on the actual device, but while you're farther away from it, you can actually regulate the particular functions of a product. So we have an on button, we have various inputs. So instead of actually constantly going to the screen and adjusting it, we could do it from the comfort of our couch. So mental models are sort of how we are set in our ways and how we are used to thinking about things. So if a particular user has a certain mental model that the designers or the engineers hadn't thought about, this is where this kind of information would come through in a usability study. So usability testing is not used for identifying if one version of a product is better than another. And again, I would like to ask you the question why this would not be a good use for a usability study. Well, the answer is, if you think back to the number of people we have in a usability study, that was about 5 to 7. Typically, to have any form of power in a research study, our sample size, our N, needs to be much larger. So again, these 5 to 7 participants are not going to make or break the minds of a designer or of a product manager. No, the only reason that we actually bring them in and we talk to them is to better understand how people might possibly understand this product to work. So, having said that, usability testing is also not used to create any sort of critical changes in products based on the subjective opinions of 5 to 7 users. So, in order to actually appreciate usability lab studies, it's really to get a better understanding of how and why people do the things they do. It's not to sort of take a vote or tally how many people voted for design A and how many voted for design B. Now in terms of interpreting results. So after a study is completed, the researcher will then analyze the observation to come up with what we call key insights. Key insights are common themes or ideas that a researcher notices throughout a majority of the participants in the study. So, for example, going back to our logging into an app experience. So, if everybody or most of the participants clear across the board were confused where the login button was, that could be a key insight. If it was just 1 or 2 people, that's not necessarily considered a key insight. But you could think of key insights as sort of like a common denominator across what all the participants were saying. So, for example, everyone was confused by the placement of the menu button. Okay, that could be an example of a key insight. Key insights are typically grouped together into a summary slide for a quick look at the results of a study. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit in more detail later, but you have to understand that the people who are going to be listening to your presentation of a report or reading it, they don't have a lot of time to go through a lot of, highly sophisticated academic words. Not to say that they're not intelligent or sophisticated, absolutely not. Everyone is just on a schedule and everyone just wants to understand the gist of the idea and move on with it quickly. So oftentimes, if things are very, very problematic, in our report we might make them in red or add a lot of exclamation marks saying, hey, this is a priority, this needs to get fixed now. Things that are not as much of a priority, that don't really hinder the entire usability of a product, we can code those sort of as like yellow or orange, right? Because it's not as severe, but could be problematic. And things that are simply understood and considered user-friendly, we might code those as something like green or with the happy face or whatnot. But so looking at a summary slide of these key insights, what popped out as red, yellow, or green is really, really helpful for who is going to be reading the results of your report. The other large responsibility of a researcher is to actually suggest recommendations based on these key insights. So that means that we, as researchers, really need to help the designers alter the design to make it more intuitive. So recommendations are based on the user's feedback, right? So as a researcher, you heard 5 to 7 people complain about a particular feature. Then using that feedback from the lab studies, we're actually able to develop some sort of a recommendation, a suggestion to make it better. We also depend on our knowledge of cognitive psychology and cognitive principles to help advise these design recommendations. So for example, going back to that menu button, consider placing the menu button in the center of the screen since that is where users expected to find it. So if you remember, our key insight was that everyone had trouble finding it. Here we're suggesting a recommendation, place it in the center since that's where everyone expected to find it. And that, of course, is coming from what the users were saying. So if they say something like, oh, I don't know where the menu button is, I thought it would be in the center, that makes sense. Most menu buttons are in the center. So you might want to add a couple quotes from participants under a recommendation like this or under a key insight to really drive the point home and to really prove that this in fact was a problem. After recommendations are implemented, another lab study is typically conducted for a newer, updated version. And we do this over and over and over again until hopefully there are no usability issues and the product is finally released. And at that point it becomes, it could be an engineering issue, it could be a bug, it could be a glitch in the system, but in terms of the design and the intended usability, hopefully we flush all of those out. Now we're going to talk about how you can actually conduct your own usability study and some of the key factors that go into that, such as creating a research script, a consent form, various observation techniques of participants' interaction with tasks, how you're going to actually record these results and put them in a final report, and then who's going to actually hear all about them. So the very first thing you need to think about doing for running a usability study is to create a script. So a research script or a moderator's guide is used to ensure that the researcher will provide the same narrative for each and every participant. So this really assists in removing confounding variables in case the researcher forgets to say one thing or behaves differently from one participant to another. And it also ensures that all of the necessary questions get answered because, again, we can't overestimate our memory. So if you think about it, a script is what actors use when they need to learn particular lines for a role, or actors in a theater. So this is the same exact thing. A researcher almost has to pretend like they're acting on stage. And so there's a particular narrative, a particular way that you would like to talk to your participants. You want to make sure that they feel comfortable. You want to make sure that they don't feel judged. So all of these things are really, really important. And you as the researcher are the main actor in your own film. So the script also ensures that all of the tasks are completed. So it's a really good way to help you stay on track. Sometimes participants tend to veer off on tangents, or they like to start telling you about their day or start, going on and on about a particular experience they had with the particular product you're testing. But again, we only have 1 hour with these participants, so it's very important for us to be able to reel them back in and make sure that the study keeps moving forward. So the script is typically written by the researcher, but it's written with guidance from the client, the stakeholder, or the design team. So basically this means that the people who are asking you to do the research should be the ones telling you specifically which questions they want answered. A researcher should always send the script for approval to the client or stakeholder before conducting the study in case there's something that needs to be changed or in case there's something that they would like to add or subtract from your script. And running a pilot study is also a really, really good idea because in a pilot study you can actually uncover certain things that you didn't ask that you think are important to ask, and it also gives you a really important sense of the amount of time it will take to actually answer all of the questions and go through all of the tasks that the stakeholder wants you to go through. So a typical usability study script focuses on the main tasks that a participant will complete during their session. So again, most technology products have a variety of different functions and interactions, but we unfortunately don't have time to test them all. So it's really important to decide which functions are critical and important to the stakeholders and to actually select those. You want to create tasks that require participants to explore those functions or interactions, and a common thing that we do is we create a flow. So we walk participants through a scenario, or we ask them to imagine themselves in a particular situation, and then we ask them how they would behave with the particular product given that situation. For example, task 1 could be, please log into your Instagram account. Second one would be, search the name of the user you want to follow. A third task, follow that user. The fourth task, leave a comment for someone that you are following. Task 5, post an update on your own profile. Task 6, edit that post. Task 7, unfollow someone that you have been following. And task 8, block another user from seeing your content. So these are common user interactions for people who use the Instagram app, for example. Although there are so many more things that you could do on Instagram, such as create filters or upload videos or whatnot. But again, these are sort of the core use cases that we've nailed down. According to, for example, a client or a stakeholder. And so these are the particular tasks that you would want participants to go through. But of course, you can't bombard them with, here's 8 tasks, go ahead and do them. Ready, set, go. So each one you have to sort of lead them into it, develop some sort of background information, and then observe and measure their performance. So some important tips for conducting a usability study, specifically for writing your script. Remember, participants have only 1 hour of time to give you feedback. You want to give yourself time to sign the consent form and to introduce yourself, right? It's not as if from the moment they walk in, you start asking them questions. You have to, again, be an actor, be personable, be friendly, make sure that they're comfortable before you can even proceed forward. You have to narrow down those tasks in your script to no more than 10. Consider how much time each task may take. Some tasks take longer than others. So in the example we just saw, it may take more time to find someone that you want to follow on Instagram, but to actually follow them, it's just a click of a button which appears right in front of you. So again, some tasks may take longer than others, and for this reason, again, pilot studies are critical for timing reasons. After the user completes a task, you want to ask them how they felt about the ease and satisfaction with which they just completed it. So while there are so many things that we can actually complete and get through, not every time is that experience a happy one. So maybe they were able to get through a task, from the ones that we just mentioned, but maybe it took them a really long amount of time. And then if you ask them, how easy was that, they'd be like, well, I did it, but it took me like 5 extra minutes because I didn't see this icon because it was too small. So that kind of qualitative information will further explain why it took such a long amount of time, which is a quantitative piece of data that we would be recording. And so you always want to end the study with some sort of concluding questions about their overall experience with the product. What I like to do is ask them what they liked most about the product and what they liked the least. Lastly, you want to ask them if they have suggestions for specific changes and how those changes could actually improve their experience with the product. So, you've created your script, you've sent it to your stakeholders, they've approved it, and now it's testing day. So the very first thing that you need to do is have the participants sign a consent form. All participants should give written communication of their consent to participate in your usability study. A consent form should assist in doing the following: explain the purpose of the study, assure complete anonymity, which means no names, phone numbers, addresses, any sort of information that will allow them to be traceable will ever be recorded. Make sure that they feel safe and comfortable. You want to make sure that they understand that this is a measurement of how well the product is able to communicate to the user, how user-friendly it is. It's not a way to measure their intelligence. It's not a way for them to be tested. There are no right or wrong answers. And you really want to stress the idea of being honest. Sometimes people are victims of reactivity, as we've learned in a previous lecture, where we tend to behave differently when we know that we're being watched. Social desirability is another common phenomenon that we see in a laboratory when people are really concerned about what others might think of them, so they will try to say, oh yes, I love this app, it's great, everything works perfectly, but that doesn't really help us in terms of user experience research. So we really want to understand their true and honest opinions. The consent form also requests their approval for audio and video recording if you actually plan to record. You want to allow participants to take breaks if needed, and you want to encourage them to be honest about their opinions. Again, assure them that they're not being tested or judged in any way. So now once they've signed the consent form, now it's actually time to run the study and record your observations. So there are many techniques used for recording a performance in a usability study. The first and most common one is just to simply take interview notes. Everything that they're saying, everything interesting, you want to make a note of, you want to just write it down. What I do typically is I have my laptop open. As I'm talking to them, I'm typing and listening to them at the same time. And again, it's very difficult to multitask when you have such high task load, so that's when those recordings would come in handy. Another common technique is to use a task logger. You can create any form of a table or template on Excel spreadsheet or Google numbers or sheets, anything like that, for a way to organize the performance per task. So you could have tasks 1 through 8 in one column, and then in the next column you can have everything the participants were saying. You can also include a column for errors. You can also include a column for how long it took them to do that. So an error log, a timer, all of these are great ways to record participant performance. The other thing that we do is we also want to record ratings for things such as importance of features. Excuse me, if you remember back to our very first lectures when we discussed the Kano method, right? How important is this feature to you in this particular product? So can you use this feature can you use this product without a particular feature? Is it something that's necessary? Is it sort of a luxury? Or is it not needed at all, right? So ratings for the importance of features. We also want to record their satisfaction. As we mentioned, people are able to get through particular tasks, but it doesn't mean that they had a good time doing it. So satisfaction and ease of use is really, really helpful. And it could be anything from bubbling happy faces, or it could be a number scale from 1 to 5, 1 to 7, any of those things. And it also helps you record user preferences. So now you've run your study, and now it's time to analyze those results. So after researchers have gone through the data of each particular participant, they come up with a list of key insights or findings, right? When you're building your report, you don't really want to fixate on this person 1 said this, person 2 said this, person 3 said this, right? You want to look for common themes because the whole point of usability testing is to find these common themes and any major standing out usability issues. So all findings are placed in a report or a presentation for the client, stakeholder, or product manager. Some critical features of this report must include an executive summary. So imagine that someone who has no idea what your research paper is about or your research study is about, but somebody had suggested that they look at this, or there's a new employee coming on the team and they're like, hey, here's a bunch of research reports that you need to look through to be up to date and see where we stand in our product development. So you always want to have some sort of an executive summary, right? It's an explanation of who the study was for and what are those main research questions that had to be answered. You also want to include the participant profile. And if you remember back to earlier in this lecture, we talked about who was the target audience and what was the criteria used for recruiting these participants. A lot of companies have their own recruiting services, but in case you are going to recruit for participants yourself, you also want to make sure that you have a specific criteria that all your participants meet. The methodology is another really important factor to include in your research report. What type of methods were used? Did you use qualitative data? Did you use quantitative data? Did you use a combination of techniques? Did you have cognitive think alouds? Did you actually use prototypes? So all of these things need to be placed in this report so anyone who has no idea about what you did will actually be able to understand and, if not, replicate exactly what you did in the future. How long did the study last? What was the sample size, right? How many people participated in it? And it's very important to include a reference to your actual study script. Another good idea is to actually put the script in the appendix of your report. The images or prototypes that were used, right? Again, was it sort of a concept test? Were you asking participants to draw things that they expect to see on a particular interface? Did you ask them to organize things using a card sort? Or did they actually interact with, some sort of a digital prototype? So you want to make sure that you explain what materials were used. And then you have, your presentation of the detailed findings. So you want to explain the performance for each task, not necessarily each person, but build your report in a way that it's structured around the tasks that you ask versus around the participants. And you want to support each finding with screenshots or images of the prototypes. So typically when you're testing a product that's in development, it has more than one screen, right? So all of the screens maybe are relative to a different type of task. So if your particular issue was, if your particular finding was an issue on the login screen, then you would explain the button for login was too small, and then you state your finding, and then you also show an image of that login screen so that people don't have to go back and try to find the prototype. It's right there, and you can make a reference to it. Additionally, you also want to back up your finding with user quotes. So if it in fact was difficult to locate, you actually want to show what participants were saying so that you can sort of prove and validate what your finding was. And then you have your list of key insights, right? So the summary, the main things that were generated across the participants. And last but not least, which is probably the hardest part of our job, is to provide valid recommendations. So you want to provide some sort of suggestions that will actually improve the currently existing design, which then most likely will trigger a new cycle for a more updated version. Lastly, you finally get to present your results. So always consider who your audience will be when presenting your findings. It's very interesting to see how people who come from academia really try to maintain that sort of academic way of speaking, but the truth is in industry, nobody really cares about that. In industry, everyone cares about getting fast results and having them be very understandable. So you want to understand that in your audience, you will probably have your product manager. You will probably have the stakeholder or the client who commissioned all of this. You will probably have the design team, right? People who worked on the designs for this prototype or this product. Maybe you might get some engineers, although typically the engineers step in much later in the process once the design has been approved. And also you might have other researchers. So researchers who work in larger companies or even in smaller companies, they're very limited. You can have like one usability researcher for like 800 designers and engineers. So we have to back each other up and support each other. And so one way that we do that is we actually attend each other's presentations, and you can also always learn something from another researcher. So make sure to speak in a way that is understandable to your audience. You want to avoid statistical terminology, right? We only have 5 to 7 participants in a usability study. There is no need for significant, not significant, averages, percentages. None of that is really necessary. You want to avoid fixating on minute details unless someone really asks you about a finding, right? So again, no one has the time of day for this. You have this like giant slideshow that you want to get through, and everyone is like waiting to go to another meeting. So just give them the highlights, the important things that they need to know, and after that you can always make yourself available if they want to ask you more questions. They can contact you by email, etc., etc. You want to maintain a positive attitude when presenting usability issues and flaws. So again, even though usability testing is used to identify the problems with the product, you don't really want to walk into a meeting to people who just designed this product and who are the managers of it and just be like, guys, this product is so bad, there were so many issues with it, right? You really don't want to start out that way. Start out in a positive way, you know, like, hey, everyone thought that the graphics were really amazing, but they sort of thought that they were a little bit confusing at the same time, right? So you got to be very diplomatic when you're presenting your results, and you want to make sure that you stay positive. And last but not least, you know, you want to keep a record of all of your reports. You never know when you might need them for a new job interview. Of course, a lot of the things that you might be doing are confidential relative to the company you work for. So of course you want to make sure that you don't violate any of those laws, but make sure that you have your own sort of record of this, you know, to keep track of your experience. And make those reports available to your clients and have them easily accessible. So maybe the product manager was absent the day that you were giving your presentation. And so you want to make sure that that product manager has easy access to your particular report. So even after you give a verbal and oral report of your findings, it's probably a good idea to send an email to the entire team with an attachment of that report, as well as keep it in some sort of a log for yourself. So in a nutshell, we sort of zipped through all you need to know to conduct your own usability laboratory study. Of course, there are so many things that we have not touched on. We're only scraping the surface, but from my personal experience, you really learn as you go. Every team you work with is different. Every project you have is going to be different. But the things that I explained to you today are actually really, really helpful and really important and really key to any sort of usability study you do for any company. I hope you found it helpful. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email to csundancingprofessor@gmail.com. Thanks so much.